Hello everyone, and welcome back to the 3T Path channel. Welcome to our Bhakti Club Uddhava-gita course. So we are now in a section of the Uddhava-gita where Krishna was giving Uddhava a summary description of the entire yoga path and emphasizing the importance of taking to the spiritual path. So it's been very powerful lessons in this respect. And now he's coming to the end of his brief explanation on the nature of the soul being stuck in matter, conditioned. And then Uddhava is going to pose some extra questions, and we're going to move on to the next chapter, and Krishna is going to start explaining, answering Uddhava's questions with some very astounding, mind-boggling statements to begin with. So if you want to catch the whole course, if you want to access the whole Uddhava-gita course, this is already our 35th class, so there's already a lot of content available. If you want to catch the whole thing, make sure you join the channel, you become a member of the channel. The description of how to do that is here in the description of the video. If you become a member of this channel, you have access to the whole course. All right, so let's get started. We are now in the 11th canto, 10th chapter, verse 33, and this is Krishna still talking to Uddhava. The conditioned soul who remains dependent on fruitive activities, in other words, the conditioned soul who's stuck here in matter in the process of karma, acting and then getting the results, and then acting and getting the results. So the person who remains dependent on fruitive activities under the modes of material nature will continue to fear me, Krishna is saying, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, since I impose the results of one's fruitive activities. So there's, people fear God because, or nature or existence, because this is where the results are being imposed on you. You act, and that was your choice. You decided how to act, but then the results of that action, you don't have a choice. It's imposed on you. You have to receive the karmic results of your previous actions. And so people get scared with that, and they fear God because of that. And those who accept the material concept of life, in other words, those who don't take to the spiritual path, taking the variegatedness of the modes of nature to be factual, in other words, people who take to material life and think this is it, this is the ultimate reality, is this material life. They devote themselves to material enjoyment and are therefore always absorbed in lamentation and grief. Hard words by Krishna here, very hard words. So he's saying, people who don't take to the spiritual path, they get stuck in matter, they are afraid of God, they're afraid of the results of their past actions, they're stuck in that. They think the material reality is the ultimate truth, and they devote themselves to trying to be happy here, to material enjoyment, but they're always absorbed in lamentation and grief. Purport: the living entity is bound in the network of illusion, Maya. But although he can understand that he is dependent upon superior powers, he does not want to serve the Supreme Lord. He thus becomes filled with fear of life itself. Desiring material sense gratification, the living entity, like the demon Kamsa is the famous Asura king who was trying to kill Krishna in Krishna's Leela, always fears destruction of his material arrangement. Remaining addicted to the flavors of material nature, one gradually sinks down into an irrational form of life. In other words, is you get stuck. If you become a materialist, naturally by the karmic reactions, you get sucked down into inferior life forms which don't have higher thinking powers like humans. Maya has two potencies. The first covers the living entity, and the second throws him down into a hellish condition of life. When one is covered by Maya, one loses all power of discrimination, and Maya then throws such a fool into the darkness of ignorance. When one wrongly considers oneself to be independent of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna, one becomes a worshipper of temporary material objects. Hoping to enjoy material sense gratification as one grows older, one's life becomes filled with fear and anxiety. Maybe you know somebody like that, right? Who's growing older and they're just full of lamentation, grief, fear. A conditioned soul considers himself to be in control of his life, but since he does not have any actual controlling potency, his situation is contradictory and not at all pleasing. And this is the problem. We think we're in control. We're thinking that we're the masters, we're the Lord, but we're not. Because in the actual fact, we don't have control. I mean, look at your life. I mean, I look at my life, just like, you know, I'm recording this at the end of the year, and so we tend to look back upon our year and all the things, you can see all those things you planned, and so many of them didn't work out. They came out so differently, like you didn't expect that, didn't expect the other thing. It's like, oh that, oh yeah, I want to do this, and this happened. I thought this was going to happen, and this happened, and we're not in control. We're definitely not in control. So then you think you're in control, you're the master, but then you can observe that you're not in control. So that you know, like that doesn't make sense, and that it's not very pleasing. That situation, it generates anxiety because you're not in control, even though you think you are. As all of one's material possessions are taken away by time, one becomes filled with lamentation. Right? Not only your material possessions, but your prestige is taken away, your fame is taken away, of course your health. I mean, aging is this wonderful spiritual teaching technique where your body just literally just starts getting away from you, your skin sagging, your abilities, your pains. It's like you can't walk anymore before you could run, you can't see, you hear, and it's just like, you know, these things are getting taken away from you. And so you can really, you know, see that something, you get filled with lamentation if you're stuck in the material platform. All in all, material life is truly abominable. And it is only because of dense illusion that we accept it as satisfactory. So again, the purport here is really strongly emphasizing this message Krishna is bringing here about the need to take the spiritual life, the brilliant stuff. Verse 34, when there is an agitation and interaction of the material modes of nature, the living entities then describe me in various ways, such as all-powerful time, the self, Vedic knowledge, the universe, one's own nature, religious ceremonies, and so on. So it's an interesting, we see some of these verses in the Vedas are really like this, where they appreciate the fact that yeah, people have different, you know, they have different religious ideas and philosophies, and they see God differently. And so people are seeing this one same Supreme Lord, you know, with different ways and different words and different names. It's very interesting that in Vedic philosophy we have this more, you know, open-minded understanding that this happens because of the influence of material nature. People will describe God and religion differently with different names. Purport. One can experience the potency of the personality of Godhead by observing how different species of life, demigods, human beings, animals, fish, birds, insects, plants, etc., gradually evolve their natures and activities. Each species of life executes a particular process of sense gratification, and this function is called the dharma of the species. Lacking knowledge of the personality of Godhead, ordinary persons catch a glimpse of the Lord's potencies in the above-mentioned manifestations. Sri Madhvacharya has cited the following information from the Tantra Bhagavatam. The Lord is called Kala, or time, because he is the mover and controller of all material qualities. Because he is complete and perfect, he is called Atma, the self, and he is the personification of all knowledge. The word Swabhava indicates that the Lord fully controls his own destiny. And as the maintainer of everyone, he is called Dharma. One on the liberated platform can achieve unlimited bliss by worshiping the personality of Godhead, whereas those who are ignorant of the Lord try to find happiness by concocting other objects of worship. If one stubbornly imagines that anything is independent of the Lord, which is the definition of Maya illusion, one will remain in the grip of the illusory network of the Lord's potency. Seeing the inevitability of the destruction of material things, one is constantly fearful and perpetually laments in the darkness of ignorance. In such darkness, there's no question of happiness. Therefore, one should never think that anything is independent of the personality of Godhead. As soon as one considers anything to be independent of the Lord, one is immediately gripped by the Lord's illusory network called Maya. One should always remain humble and obedient to the personality of Godhead, even when one is liberated, and thus one will achieve the supreme spiritual happiness. Okay, now, so Krishna finished that, powerful call to spiritual life, and this has led Uddhava to have some more questions. And this is how the whole Uddhava-gita works, like the Bhagavad-gita. This is any encounter between spiritual master and disciple, questions and answers. So now Uddhava-gita, as a perfect disciple, has more questions to stimulate more amazing answers for us. So now, verse 35, Uddhava takes the word. Sri Uddhava said, "O my Lord, a living entity situated within the material body is surrounded by the modes of nature, and the happiness and distress that are born of activities caused by these modes." So he understands. He says, yes, we're here in material nature, and this is all gunas, and then I will suffer or be happy as a result of the activities caused by these modes. So he understood what Krishna was explaining. How is it possible that he is not bound by his material encirclement? In other words, how are you going to get out of this? How can you not be a materialist, he's saying. It may also be said that the living entity is ultimately transcendental and has nothing to do with the material world. Then how is he ever bound by material nature? So he's like, look, there's these two things. Either you're in matter, and so what can you do? You're just stuck in matter anyway. Or, the soul is transcendental, so how can he be stuck in matter anyway? How can we even talk about being bound by material nature? Because the soul's transcendental. So it's a great question. It's a really, really good question. Purport. Due to the influence of the modes of nature, the material body generates fruitive activities, right? That's what we described in the last class, which in turn generate material happiness and distress. So that was an important point Krishna explained in the last class. We talked about, very important point. This material chain reaction is indicated by the word deha jeshu. The personality of Godhead has shown Uddhava that the actual goal of life is liberation, not sense gratification. Although the Lord has indicated that the living entity is liberated by devotional service performed with knowledge and renunciation, Uddhava apparently does not understand the specific means of perfection. According to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Uddhava's questions implies that we observe even in the activities of liberated souls, such external activities as eating, sleeping, walking, hearing, speaking, etc., which are functions of the gross and subtle bodies. Thus, if even liberated souls are situated within the gross and subtle material bodies, then how are they not bound by the material modes of nature? If it is argued that the living entity is like the sky, which never mixes with any other object and therefore is not bound, then one may ask how such a transcendental living entity can ever be bound by material nature. In other words, how would material existence be possible? In order to completely clarify the path of Krishna consciousness, Uddhava presents this question to the supreme spiritual authority, Lord Krishna. In the kingdom of Maya, there are innumerable speculations about the Supreme Lord, who is variously described as non-existent, or as possessing material qualities, or as being devoid of all qualities, or as being a neuter object like a eunuch. But through mundane speculation, it is not possible to understand the nature of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, Uddhava wants to clear the path of spiritual liberation so that people can actually understand that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. As long as one is affected by the modes of nature, perfect understanding is not possible. Lord Krishna will now describe to Uddhava further details of spiritual emancipation on the road back home, back to Krishna. But first, Uddhava has some more questions. So verses 36 and 37, which then that would be the end of the chapter. These are the last verses of this chapter. More questions from Uddhava. Then we're going to get to Krishna answering these questions, which are going to blow our mind away with a very, very mind-boggling statement. So translations, here we go. Oh my Lord, Achyuta. He calls Krishna, Achyuta is another name of God, Achyuta, infallible. Oh my Lord, Achyuta, the same living entity is sometimes described as eternally conditioned, and at other times as eternally liberated. So you'll see this this description. You see these words, Nitya Bandha, Nitya Mukta. You'll see this come up in different texts. And it's very confusing because Nitya Bandha, Bandha, stuck, like think of a band, stuck. So Nitya Bandha, Nitya. So the soul eternally conditioned, stuck. And then Nitya Mukta, liberated. Mukti, liberation. So you see these terms and we'll explain them. But it's a little confusing. Like, how can you be eternally conditioned, eternally liberated? What is that all about? I am not able to understand, therefore, the actual situation of the living entity, Uddhava says. You, my Lord, are the best of those who are expert in answering philosophical questions. Please explain to me the symptoms by which one can tell the difference between a living entity who is Nitya Mukta, eternally liberated, and one who is Nitya Bandha, eternally conditioned. In what various ways would they remain situated, enjoy life, eat, evacuate, lie down, sit, or move about? So then it's a similar question to what Arjuna asks Krishna in Bhagavad-gita when Krishna talks about the person in samadhi, the liberated state of being. Arjuna says, so how does he eat, sit, sleep, walk about? Like they ask these guys, like, how does he behave? They ask him with this kind of terminology. How does he sit, eat, lie down, move, like, what are they like? I want to know what it's like. And then the description allows us to move towards that direction. So, before we get going, because this is a really confusing thing, it's just a question of translation, really. So, Nitya, this word Nitya, which is translated as eternal, is an eternal, in quotation marks. It's not really eternal. It's an eternal until. It has a clause, there's an if. It's eternal if, or until. So there's a time limit on this eternal. It's not like an eternal in the sense of like, God's always existence. It's not like that. It's a different kind of eternal. It's an eternal until. So the idea of Nitya Bandha, when you see that, say, I'm Nitya Bandha. Eternally conditioned until you take to the spiritual path, right? It depends. There's a clause. It's up to until that point. Because if you don't take the spiritual path, you will remain with no set period of time. Eternally, you remain conditioned. Do you understand? That's how Nitya comes along. And then Nitya Mukta is like, okay, you're eternally liberated from that point onwards. So nitya bandha, from that point onwards, you were eternally conditioned. And then when you took the spiritual life and attained perfection, nitya mukta, from that point on, you're eternally liberated. Okay, so there's a, nitya bandha has a beginning and end. And nitya mukta has a beginning, it doesn't have an end though. So goes on forever, because once you attain spiritual perfection, Krishna explains in Bhagavad-gita, you never again fall into illusion. Now let me read the purport here and then we'll go on to Krishna's answer. In previous verses, Lord Krishna has explained to Uddhava that an eternally liberated soul is beyond the three modes of material nature. Since a liberated soul is considered to be beyond even the superior mode of goodness, sattva guna, how can he be recognized? By false identification with the modes of nature, which produce one's own material body, one is bound by illusion. On the other hand, by transcending the modes of nature, one is liberated. However, in ordinary activities such as eating, evacuating, relaxing, sitting, and sleeping, a liberated soul and a conditioned soul appear to be the same. Of course, right? You're like a completely enlightened, liberated person, perfection in spirituality, but you're still walking around, you still go to the bathroom, you still eat and relax and sit down and lie down and sleep. All these things are still going on. But the person's liberated already, so there's this confusion, right? Therefore, Uddhava is inquiring, by what symptoms can I recognize that one living entity is performing such external activities without false ego? And by what symptoms can I recognize one who is working under the illusory bondage of material identification? This is difficult because the ordinary bodily functions of liberated and conditioned personalities appear similar. Uddhava has approached the Supreme Personality of Godhead, taking him as his personal spiritual master, and wants to be enlightened about how to understand the differences between material and spiritual life. So very important, classic questions. Since the living entity is sometimes called eternally conditioned, how can he ever be considered eternally liberated, or vice versa? This is an apparent contradiction which will be cleared up by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Okay, brilliant stuff. So now this is the end. We finish chapter 10 and we'll skip right along now to chapter 11. So now chapter 11 will start with Krishna's answers. So verse 1. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "My dear Uddhava, due to the influence of the material modes of nature, the gunas, which are under my control, the living entity is sometimes designated as conditioned and sometimes as liberated. In fact, however, the soul is never really bound up or liberated. And since I am the Supreme Lord of Maya, which is the cause of the modes of nature, I also am never to be considered liberated or in bondage." So this is like, wow, like what? So Krishna is saying, what? The living entity, the soul, is never really bound up or liberated. What are we all doing here then? What's going on? I mean, aren't we like conditioned now? Aren't we striving for spiritual liberation? What? No, it's like you're never bound and you're never liberated. This is all designations. It's like, it blows your mind a bit. But then if you go beyond it, you see, oh yeah, I understand now. What Krishna is saying is like, it's all illusion. It's just like a temporary, illusory situation. So it's not true in the sense that it doesn't exist, didn't exist forever in the past, and it won't exist forever in the future. So it's just a transitory, illusory moment. but he's going to explain it a little more. But it's just like a great, really sets you up, doesn't it? Like, what? I'm not, the souls really are never bound and they're never liberated? What's going on? Purport. In this chapter, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, explains the different characteristics of conditioned and liberated life, the symptoms by which one can recognize saintly persons, and the various processes of devotional service to the Lord. So it's going to be a very powerful chapter. Make sure you come back to hear all of it. In the previous chapter, Uddhava inquired from the Lord how conditioned and liberated life are possible. The Lord now replies that Uddhava's questions is somewhat superficial, since the pure spirit soul is never entangled in the material energy of the Lord. The living entity imagines a false connection with the three modes of nature and accepts the material body as the self. The living entity therefore suffers the consequences of his own imagination, just as one suffers the illusory activities of a dream. This does not indicate that the material world is illusory in the sense that it is non-existent. The material world is certainly real, being the potency of the personality of Godhead. And the living entity, being the superior potency of God, is also real. But the living entity's dream of being part and parcel of the material world is an illusion that drags him into the contradictory state called material conditioned life. The living entity is never actually baddha or bound up, since he merely imagines a false connection with the material world. This is like, wow, this is great stuff. I mean, it's trippy. Maybe you don't see it now, but this is powerful stuff. This is powerful meditation. Just listen to this again if you didn't get it. Just listen to the class again. Meditate on these points. This is powerful, powerful stuff. Because there is ultimately no permanent connection between the living entity and matter, there is no actual liberation. The living entity, being eternally transcendental to the inferior material energy of the Lord, is eternally liberated. Lord Krishna reveals that in one sense the living entity is factually not bound up and thus cannot be liberated. But in another sense, the term bondage and liberation can be conveniently applied to indicate the particular situation of the individual soul, who is the marginal potency of the Lord. Although the individual soul is never actually bound to matter, he suffers the reaction of material nature because of false identification. And thus the term baddha, or bound up, may be used to indicate the nature of a living entity's experience within the inferior energy of the Lord. Since baddha describes a false situation, freedom from such a false situation may also be described as moksha, or liberation. Therefore, the terms bondage and liberation are acceptable if one understands that such terms only refer to temporary situations created by illusion and do not refer to the ultimate nature of the living entity. I think it's becoming clearer now, right? It's becoming clear. Like, you are always an eternal soul, transcendental being, Atma. You're always that. But then, because of illusion, you may identify with matter, with the gunas, and then you get stuck in this identification here, and suffering and samsara. And then at some point, you have a beautiful Uddhava-gita course, you understand, you receive the Lord's instructions, and then you become liberated. So in a sense, you were never really bandha, because it was all illusion. It wasn't true. You're always an Atman, you're always a transcendent being. But another way of saying, yeah, for a while you were under illusion, so yeah, okay, you got conditioned and you got liberated. Interesting, isn't it? In this verse, Lord Krishna states, Gunasya maya mulatvan name moksho nabandhanam. The terms liberation and bondage can never be applied to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, since He is the Absolute Truth and the Supreme Controller of everything. So for God, this would never work, because He is the master of the gunas, not we. We're not the master. We can come under the influence of material nature, God's inferior potency, which is what's happening now with us, and gradually we can overcome them with the help of the Lord. But God, He can never come under the influence of His own inferior energy. Lord Krishna is eternally the supreme transcendental entity, and He can never be bound by illusion. It is the duty of the illusory potency of the personality of Godhead to attract the living entities to ignorance by creating the false impression of a blissful existence separate from Lord Krishna. The illusory conception of existence apart from the personality of Godhead is called Maya, or material illusion. Since Lord Krishna is the supreme absolute controller of Maya, there is no possibility that Maya could have any influence over the personality of Godhead. Thus, the terms bandhanam, or bondage, cannot be applied to the eternal, blissful, and omniscient personality of Godhead. The term moksha, or liberation, indicating freedom from bandhana, is equally irrelevant to the Lord. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has commented on this verse as follows. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is endowed with great spiritual potencies. Because of mundane concoction, the conditioned soul imagines that the Absolute Truth is devoid of variegated spiritual potencies, by which he may enjoy blissful life. Although the living entity is the spiritual potency of the Lord, he is presently situated in the inferior, illusory potency, and by engaging in mental speculation, he becomes bound in conditioned life. Liberation means that the living entity should transfer himself to the spiritual potency of the Lord, which can be divided into three categories. Hladini, the potency of bliss, Sandini, the potency of eternal existence, and Samvit, the potency of omniscience. Since the personality of God is eternally endowed with a pure existence of bliss and knowledge, he is never conditioned or liberated. The living entity, however, being entangled in the Lord's material potency, is sometimes conditioned and sometimes liberated. The neutral, original state of the three modes of nature is called Maya. When the three modes of nature interact, one of them will become powerful, subordinating the other two modes until another mode becomes prominent. That's how it works. Krishna talks about that. The three modes, sattva, rajas, and tamas, there's always competition between them. It's a flux. It's always in a flux. So like, you'll notice that sometimes, sattva, and then rajas comes up, and then tamas, and then rajas, and then sattva. There's always competition. Although the threefold material potency expands from the personality of Godhead, the Lord himself in his personal form is the actual abode of the three spiritual potencies, namely eternality, bliss, and knowledge. If one desires to become free from the entanglement of conditioned life within the material sky, called the kingdom of Maya, one must come to the spiritual sky, wherein the living entities are filled with bliss, possess eternal spiritual bodies, and engage in the loving devotional service of the Lord. By developing one's eternal spiritual form in the loving service of the Lord, one immediately transcends the duality of conditioned life and in personal liberation, and can directly experience the spiritual potencies of the Lord. At that time, there is no possibility of false identification with the material world. Realizing oneself to be eternal spirit soul, the living entity can understand that he is never truly connected to matter, because he is part of the superior energy of the Lord. Therefore, both material bondage and liberation are ultimately meaningless within the reality of the spiritual sky. The living entity is the marginal potency of the Lord and should exercise his free will to engage in the pure devotional service of the Lord. By reviving one's eternal spiritual body, one can understand oneself to be a minute particle of the spiritual potency of the Lord. In other words, the living entity is a minute particle of eternity, bliss, and omniscience. And thus, in full Krishna consciousness, there is no possibility of his being carried away by the illusion of the three modes of nature. In conclusion, it may be stated that the individual living entity is never actually in matter and is thus not liberated, although his illusory state may be accurately described as entangled and liberated. On the other hand, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is eternally situated in his own spiritual potencies and can never be described as being bound up, and thus there is no meaning to the concept of the Lord's freeing himself from such a non-existent condition. Very powerful philosophy here, great, deep philosophical concepts, isn't it? Just really amazing stuff. I hope that hasn't blown your mind too much and it has helped you get a glimpse into the spiritual reality of described here in the Uddhava-gita. Have the rest of your day with lots of peace and lots of love. Hare Krishna.